Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my reading wrap-up video for August 2025. I've waited until mid-September to finally get this up, in part because I wanted to have my literary newsletter ready for you, which I'll link to down below. In my literary newsletter, I have snippets of the Goodreads reviews I wrote for these books. I also have a summary of literary news that caught my fancy. I have a book pick, a book quote, etc., so check it out. Some of the reading I did in August was for the BookTube Prize Finals, which I can't talk about as an official judge, but otherwise I read 5 additional books that I can talk about here. There's a bit of a theme, I'd say international, although most of it does center around Israel, and there is one book that takes place in Italy. And there are a few women in translation or translator books in here as well, fitting with August as Women in Translation Month. So the first book I'll talk about is Parallel Lines by Ruth Eglash. This was one of my Raid the Shelves books that I got last year in September. So anyway, this book is about 3 teenage girls in Jerusalem, and they sort of convene around 2 terrorism attacks that are adjacent to or take place in the Jerusalem light rail system. And I was a little bit hesitant at first, thinking I hope that this isn't too polemic or anything, but I do think, these 3 girls came from 3 different backgrounds. Tamar is the secular Israeli Jewish girl. Noor is the Palestinian citizen, Muslim citizen of Israel. And then Rivki is a Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jew. So they have very different outlooks on things, and I think that the writer did a good job of fleshing all of them out and not making any of them sound too crazy or anything. In fact, they're definitely the moderates of the group, and Tamar and Noor have some people in their families or their friends that veer into extremes, and the 2 of them are grappling with what they believe and where they stand. And they also have, family in both cases that are more moderate like them. Rivki is a little bit of the odd one out because her storyline is more about feeling out of place with her Haredi community, and it just doesn't jive quite as much, and I didn't quite feel as connected to her as a character for a little bit. But for Tamar and Noor, there were different things going on. Tamar started the story. Somebody might have brushed against her or even cupped her inappropriately and freaked her out on the metro station, as a form of assault or light rail station. And one of her friends in a band she's in was very insistent it had to be an Arab man. And that's, of course, starting into this subplot where he's trying to get her more involved in right-wing extremist groups that are blaming the Muslim Arab Palestinian population, I should say, for their problems and fighting back against that. And then Noor has a brother who is protesting the arrest or the death of a neighbor, and then she has a cousin from America who has very radical, strident views, and the cousin comes to live with them for a while, and they're going into the West Bank to protest, and the protest gets a little bit violent. And then for Rivki, she has a chronic health condition which sends her into a hospital where she has interactions with secular Israelis, and meanwhile her sister is courting and about to get married, and it's about how Rivki feels really out of touch and out of sorts with her family in large part. And then the broader plot things come into place when, the 3 girls are, on the light rail together at 2 different times. And they only meet at the end, and the 3rd time, which actually they are witness to an assault by a terrorist on a couple of passengers, and they're able to try and stop it. So this is a book that I think, the author deliberately wrote it for a young adult audience and with a message to convey about tolerance and coming together for coexistence. And so it is a little bit, well, maybe I'll go with a Jewish Book Council review. It's not preachy, but it's a little instructive in that way. But I was more impressed than I thought I would be that the characters had more dimension for the most part than I thought. The writing is a little pedestrian. This is an indie published book and she, the author, is a journalist, and I think that also catapulted this book, like it helped her with her marketing and so forth. And I think, like some journalists I hear about, their attempts to go into fiction is that, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a jaded way of hearing people talk about it in reporting circles. It's the never-ending conflict in a lot of ways. And so she's veering into this fiction to try to actually think of ways to, change the future for the better. I mean, it can be noted this book is pre-October 7th, and it also doesn't go into a whole lot of detail about the West Bank or Gaza or anything like that. It's centered on Jerusalem and on the Green Line, mostly in Israel. But I think, in its own way, talking with these specific people who are part of these specific communities, it's supposed to be uplifting about ways that peace and coexistence at least can be attainable. Next, I read Trick by Domenico Starnone, translated by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is my second Starnone book, which has been translated by Lahiri. I think it's similar. I mean, both books are kind of more novella length in a way and are very narrow about following just a handful of characters around. This book largely centers on a grandfather and a grandson. The grandfather, Daniele, is an illustrator. He lives in Milan, but he grew up in Naples. This is modern day, pretty much. And he's called back to Naples in his old apartment because his daughter and son-in-law are math academics, and they're called to a conference, and they need someone to take care of their 4-year-old son, Mario. And Daniele is the obvious choice, although as a grandfather, he's pretty deeply self-absorbed and largely disinterested in the child. But that's where we are right now. And then this is also sort of an allegory or commentary on Henry James, and a story that he wrote, which is about a man who lives abroad and then returns home to New York and kind of is confronting his past and his life. And that's really what's happening with Daniele here when he's coming back to Naples and the apartment he used to live in, and he's ruminating on, who is his family and what about the wife that he basically threw away in the past. He's a man who's largely focused on his career. And in fact, most of his interest in his grandson comes when he realizes his grandson can be a really good mimic of the grandfather. And so I guess that puts him in a little bit of an existential crisis about my star is dimming and what's going to happen with the boy. Maybe he's on the rise. I really liked the little boy who was precocious, and there was a lot about him that seemed very appropriate to the age. Frankly, Daniele as a narrator, he could be grating, with how self-absorbed he was sometimes, although it is a nice length, just to have a brief glimpse into this character, and maybe I should have some sympathy for someone under a deadline where he's trying to get his illustrations in, and his boss is saying they're not good enough, and so he is trying desperately to get work done, but he also has to take care of a kid who has a few boundaries, because, he is the one who, needs some protection and can't take care of himself. And then there's also a Chekhov's balcony sort of on the in the apartment, with a door that could lock people out of the apartment, which of course comes into play. There are also illustrations in the back of the book that, it's when Starnone is writing a Daniele-inspired story that's similar to James's, but about Daniele's experiences, although I thought it was a little redundant and just not as interesting as the actual, novella itself. But, I liked the pictures, and I liked, getting to take a look into Jhumpa Lahiri, thinking of the translation. The actual title in Italian actually means treat or trick, which we thought was or she thought was too similar to Halloween, which really isn't, an appropriate cultural reference for this book. So she talked about translation a bit, which I appreciated, taking into account, especially for Women in Translation Month. My next book and next translated book is Hunting in America by Tehila Hakimi, which I held up in a couple recent videos. It's a 2025 release, or at least the translation by Joanna Chen is. And so I put that in my Mock Reads General Fiction video, and then also in my book haul for last month. So this is also a slight sort of novella about an unnamed protagonist who moves from Israel and takes a job in America, or really it's for an international company that, headquartered in Israel, and she moves to the American office. She is running from something opaque in her past, which comes up later in backstory a little bit. But this largely is a book that feels archetypal to me, and I've been ruminating on it quite a bit, especially the parts that speak to me the most and I identify with the most, because this is a novel, it seems largely about dehumanization, that our protagonist is in this middle management job, and the way that her job works is like playing a game where you have to know the rules and you can't be too personal. And sometimes you're in conflict with your company and you have to figure out, like, she wants to stay in America and they're like, doing a rigmarole where they're, speaking double speak and debating whether they want to send her back or close down her office or something. And there's just always some sort of, hypocrisy going on in the workplace, it feels like. And meanwhile, she has to de-Israelify her bluntness, and there's, gendered politics going on about how women are perceived. And into this, she engages in an affair with one of her new colleagues who takes her hunting. And I think that's, this book has like progressive hunting trips that our protagonist goes on, and it dehumanizes her even more. And she talks about targets and animals, and at the end there's a question of whether she hit a human animal or another type of animal, and how that bleeds into the rest of her life. And her life is becoming just more dissociative, as it seems like she's in a push or pull with her employer about what her future's going to be, and then this hunting is like a release, but it's also dehumanizing. And that's really what spoke to me here the most, was sort of how hunting and the workplace are like these games you have to play, but you have to keep your emotional distance. And maybe this to me is like how Severance is, which I can't watch that show because I think I'd be too triggered by it. But in a way, this feels like it could be the book form of that show, about, the dissociation between, this game work self and then your personal life. We do ultimately get to her personal life a little bit, and that's what I found jarring, because otherwise the characters are largely archetypal. So when you're trying to get to know this character as a more individual person, it just didn't quite fit as well for me. And I do feel like maybe, these are sort of short vignette chapters, and it's possible, especially with the hunting stuff, that I missed some details in it, that I wasn't as engaged. I definitely had a more biased interest in the commentary on the work culture. And that sort of, archetypal commentary, which is somewhat unusual for me to read about in fiction because I'm a character-driven, emotional reader. But that stuck with me, sort of the archetypal commentary. And then Joanna Chen talked about how it was difficult to get into this character's head because she is so emotionally muted and, not a stereotypical, nuanced protagonist, as it were. But I thought it was a unique book for me to read. My last translated book of this lot I have on audio. This is MISOPHONIA by Dana Vownickel. So MISOPHONIA is translated from the German, although a lot of the book does take place in Israel, but we actually start in America. It's a very international book, particularly encapsulated by the protagonist Margarita. Margarita is ostensibly a German Jew, and that's where she grew up and spent most of her life, and she's still a teenager, about 14, 15. But her mother's family, her grandparents live in Chicago, and every summer, she goes for several months to stay with them. And Margarita is now a jaded, disaffected teenager who feels largely out of step with her grandparents and kind of views this whole thing as a burden to bear. Also complicating things is the fact that her mother actually left the family and has been estranged from them for years. So her mother was an American-born Jew, and then her father is an Israeli-born Jew who is now a cantor and, works in Berlin and moved his family to Berlin. But he and his wife met when the wife, Marcia, was, a student in Jerusalem, and he was kind of looking for an escape. Avi, this man's name, was looking for an escape from Israel, and I think his, overly right-wing turning nationalistic family, and was sort of out of step with them, especially after his stint in the Air Force. And then he turned in a new religious direction, as it were. And now he is a cantor in Germany, and he is a secondary narrator in this story. While his daughter is away in America, he engages on an affair with a congregant's daughter, which largely seems to be a commentary in and of itself about the German Jewish community that, crops up a little bit in this book about what is this community. And it seems like in this book, at least, they're largely the assimilating families of Holocaust survivors, or they are the guilt-ridden converts of Nazi ancestry. And the way that Marcia and maybe other Jews in this book look at the German Jewish community is like, you're sleeping with the enemy, this is just, crazy that you're still there, which, comes to play a bit on Margarita, who is a German Jew. That's just who she is, and that is her identity and her upbringing. But anyway, to come back to the main story, the grandparents have decided abruptly to try to send Margarita to visit her mother, Marcia, who is now in a fellowship in Hebrew University. And Margarita isn't thrilled about this, but her father from Germany and then her grandparents in Chicago put her on a plane. And it's kind of crazy because, she's completely alone going to Israel on her own. I mean, I guess she's traveled on her own from Germany to America, but not, to Israel completely alone. I think it's her first time in Israel to visit a mother who's completely estranged from her and doesn't even show up on time to the airport. Anyway, there's some subplots going on here, like Margarita meets an Israeli contemporary on the plane, Lior, and they get to flirting, and actually she spends the night at his house, and they have a bit of a hookup that, takes her a little bit through her time in Israel, where she's staying with her estranged mother, this woman who walked out on her, so things are rather awkward in some ways. And Marcia's this self-involved sort of woman who actually Margarita can kind of identify with a bit, because they both have these sort of jaded qualities to them, which frankly I find more sympathetic in a teenager than in Marcia. And in fact, into this miasma comes like this shocking revelation about their ancestry that sends Margarita on a tailspin, and so she decides to escape for a day into Tel Aviv, where her phone dies on her, and her mother actually gets freaked out about this and calls Avi, and Avi comes from Germany to Jerusalem, and then things spiral out even more from there, although all of these subplots, there's sort of a en media res quality about them. They're not neatly tied up, which does feel a little bit, more apropos to reality, but it's also a little bit jarring in a way, like they're kind of moving on the wind, this makeshift family and their sort of, abrupt choices. I was invested when I was reading the book, and I appreciated what the author did with, like, the emotional realities, especially that Margarita was going through, and it was interesting commentary on sort of being stuck between these three different sort of Jewish cultures. And I appreciated what the translator, Adam Nathan West, said about trying to get into the head of someone who was much different than him, like Margarita, who was, a girl and half his age, but he's somebody who believes in, like, the idea of sort of universal empathy, and that, we can actually get into each other's shoes a little bit, which is sort of nice commentary for this age in and of itself. And the final book I've read for this month really veered away from everything I've been talking about, and it is my favorite book of the month, so what do you know? This is Good Morning Midnight by Lily Brooks-Dalton. This is, non-translated fiction, and it is not general or literary fiction at all. This is science fiction. It's a post-apocalyptic novel, in fact, but, of the quieter, ruminative variety that I do like. So maybe a little literary in that sense. I think it's something maybe you could comp to Station 11. I don't think that quite fits. I was thinking a lot about Contact, the movie inspired by Carl Sagan's book. Not as much the book, although, frankly, I don't remember the book as well as I remember the movie. But anyway, in this book, there is this, catastrophe event that happens on Earth that the author, Brooks-Dalton, very deliberately wants to keep opaque, because that's not the point. And we're following two protagonists. The first protagonist is Augie, and he is a aging astronomer living at a research facility in the Arctic, and he refuses to evacuate when the army evacuates people, presumably because the world is ending, as it were. But he just wants to stay with his research. And then, improbably, he comes across a young child stowaway called Iris, and they live together, and they ultimately realize after, like, all of, months to a year or so of isolation that, maybe they actually want to reach out and see if anyone else is still alive and around in the human race. And Augie realizes there's a more powerful radio station / research facility somewhat nearby. It's, in this weather, like it's winter in the Arctic, it's difficult to get to, but they do ultimately get to it. And they find a good store of food and this powerful radio where ultimately Augie might want to start contacting, to see if anyone else is around. And one person who more or less is around is Sully, or Sullivan. And she is an astronaut aboard this spaceship called the Ether. She and her fellow crew have been around Jupiter, researching around Jupiter's moons, and they're on their way back. And we start at about the mark where 3 weeks ago Mission Control went silent abruptly. And so they're kind of freaking out, like what would actually, make Mission Control completely go silent? What could, destroy the world so quickly that they don't even have time to warn us? Which, to me, that is a quibble I have with this book. I feel like, I get that Brooks-Dalton didn't want to go into the whats and whys and hows of whatever catastrophe befell us, but I thought, at the very least, even the Georgia flu in Station 11 could give enough, of a forewarning that, Mission Control could say, hey, the Army's moving us somewhere, we'll be back in touch when we can, and then they aren't able to. But at least some sort of warning. It feels kind of crazy that it would end so abruptly. But anyway, that's the point, or at least the point of the book, I should say, is about these people. And first of all, this is like a little family that's living on this spaceship, and first, you see the ways that the different members are responding to the fact that, something like unforeseen and catastrophic has happened at home, and they're completely powerless to know what it is. So, things kind of devolve a little bit in terms of, their mission on this ship. With both Sully and Augie, we get backstories about the two of them, and sort of they both are dealing with estrangement from their families and, their passion about their work. So it is a ruminative novel about these two characters in a lot of ways. They do have to deal with, external threats, on the ship, the communications array somehow detaches from the ship, and they have to, repair it or make a new one, and going out into space, as always, obviously can be dangerous. And then Sully and Iris are living in this sort of, it almost feels like an alien, climb of their own in the Arctic with, which is even indicative in the title of the Midnight Morning sort of thing, and how days last for so long. And, a lot of the time they're living by a lake that's completely frozen. And they have these striking views from the heavens above that I can barely understand from a city, that sort of thing. And meanwhile, Sully is on this sort of miniature Earth, returning to Earth, and thinking about her own past and her relationships with these people around her, including something that might turn romantic with the, commander of the ship, which, actually, I really liked the characterization and the ruminativeness given to these characters, and really that what they are going through is trying to find connection, which, it feels like then the catastrophe becomes like the metaphor, because, that makes it more desperate for people in an existential way to find connection with one another. And Augie ultimately is able, with his radio signal, once, the ether gets closer to Earth, he can reach out to Sully and the others and try to form this connection with them. And there's other, spoiler reveals in this story that I will keep mum on as well. But overall, I think what she's trying to do is really be ruminative, and I just fell for you know, the characterization given to these characters, and then these more universal desires to connect with one another. And I think I love this sort of landscape for it. You know, I love when science fiction can do this in such a maximalist way, you know, invoking space travel and even the possibility of an apocalypse. But again, I talk about this sometimes with post-apocalyptic fiction. I like focusing on hope in the worst sorts of darkness, and that's what this book feels like to me too. And meanwhile, there is a Netflix adaptation that George Clooney directed a few years ago that now I want to watch and relate to this book. I have a feeling, given the trailer, it's going to be a little more action-packed than the book, but probably less so than your most high-octane survival stories, that sort of thing. So I am looking forward to that, and I'll link the trailer down below. And that about covers it for me now. Again, I'll also link to my literary newsletter down below. I will be back on this channel hopefully very soon with a Would You Read It video. Speaking of the BookTube Prize, I do look at ballots from yesteryear in fiction, and I go ahead and I read the first few paragraphs to a page of these books and discuss them with you, so stay tuned for that. And I hope you are enjoying your reading, and if you took part in Women in Translation Month in any way, I hope you enjoyed them. I'd love to hear about the books you picked up. And thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.